Show to Creep Show!
The Demon Sword Master of Excalibur Academies. Okay, so, get this. We start with an overly dense and boring cold open full of so much fantasy jargon that it makes Skyrim look like it's holding stuff back. But wait, we're planning on subverting things because we're so clever like that, so instead of making an interesting fantasy world, we fill it with nothing but cliches. So there are a bunch of demon lords facing off against a high sage, and people use the most generic type of magic, and the demon lord is a big bone guy in a castle who fights with skeletons. But wait, he has to go into hibernation for 1,000 years, and when he wakes up, we're a science fantasy story now, with completely different lore, and with new enemies and powers that work a different way so we can dedicate even more time to boring exposition. But wait, he's turned into a 10-year-old boy, and enters a vaguely romantic subplot with a 15-year-old Demon Sword Master is, above all else, a poorly told story. It's something that leans on exposition above and beyond what there are sympathetic explanations for. There's a lot of ground to cover, not all of which can be shown environmentally, but it's not just that. Exposition seems to be the only way that this story knows how to get across just about any information. Our protagonist, Leo, is taken to this academy that people go to in order to learn how to fight monsters, and your classic predatory bully character comes up to the female lead to neg her and try to recruit her, and he mentions not just that she lacks any special power, but also that it is in her blood to have a special power, which on its own is super awkward and forced, but could potentially have been workshopped into something watchable. However, the next thing to happen is Leo's internal commentary butting in to point out how she must come from a prestigious bloodline, an idea we already were clued in on by the comment that was just made. It speaks to a lack of confidence, not just in that the show feels the need to shovel world building into your line of sight in order to keep your attention, but also that it doesn't trust you to pick up on basic cues. There's also just some really poorly conceived scenes and pacing where it doesn't really understand what it takes to earn a moment. The tragic backstory of these two girls is demonstrated at the start of episode 2. They are in a plane while this girl's parents fight monsters outside, and the whole moment consists of a still, shaking room with these two girls holding each other and trying to comfort one another. It's meant to be this dark, gritty, real moment where they try desperately to hold on to a fake hope, their sanity teetering, but the whole moment is full of clunky exposition, it's really hokey and fake feeling, and it's being done for two characters who've already demonstrated themselves to be flat and mostly existing for the sake of eye candy and plot convenience. It's a shame because the protagonist is somewhat likable. When he's allowed to just be a fish out of water, like this fantastic scene where he's bewildered as he stumbles through a security system, it really works, but so far it's a minority of the story. None of this is getting into the fact that the story is just really creepy. Shota stuff aside, the bully character uses mind control on girls and it's implied to be a sex thing, and Shota stuff no longer aside, episode 2 ends with her joining him in the bath. Save me, Chainsaw Man!
Even weirder, lonely Creep Show!
Ragna Crimson is a show that's really good at pretending it's more than it actually is. The basic premise is that Ragna and Leo are dragon hunters. Dragons in this world are the main threat to humanity, and these two are people who hunt them. Leo is like 12 years old, and in spite of this is the strongest dragon hunter of them all, who works with the older Ragna despite him being kind of weak. She wants him to reward her with head pats, and while she acts very much her age in some ways, she is just mature enough to fulfill Ragna's emotional needs. Also, the show calls specific attention to how they bathe and sleep together, so Ragna gets all these visions from his future self about how he'll fail to protect Leo, get edgy as a result, swear to take vengeance on dragonkind, meet new friends he then also loses, and then attain ultimate power only once he had no one left to save. So does that mean that humanity was wiped out at that point? You'd think it'd have to be, because otherwise he could just find new people to protect, like he did earlier. But he doesn't even mention the idea of an apocalypse in the exposition dump. Even if it's revealed down the line to be true, it's apparently not key to our understanding of future Ragna's rationale. That's because all of this is a setup to the kind of power fantasy you'd find in any generic isekai. Future Ragna gives past Ragna ultimate power, and now past Ragna has the strength to protect his Imoto. It's not a character arc, it's a contrived excuse to have this kind of power fantasy while seeming literary and deep. But the thing is, Ragna Crimson, based off its beginning, is neither of those things. Its themes are close to non-existent. Ragna's trauma cascade is really just an incredibly unoriginal and shallow tackling of the topic of grief, aggressively rushed through, but gilded with lots of scenes of him crying and screaming, plus some dream sequences, in order to give the veneer of importance and emotional depth. In reality, it's just a bog-standard revenge fantasy that feels the need to waste your time. It has this unique aesthetic and color palette, like it's trying to let you know it's one of the real ones, but in reality the story is written, a lot of the time, like your bog-standard light novel trash, with lots of the same archetypes and bad tropes, and when it tries to do something deep and cool, it falls on its face. Like, it does that thing that deep stories do where it'll take a break from developing the plot to just have two characters do something that seems simple and unimportant, but it's a symbol of so much more. But the so much more here is like, oh, Ragna cares about Leo. Shakespeare. Intense Darling in the Franxx energy coming off this show.
Put the boot straight in my mouth, though.
Berserk of Gluttony is a confused amalgamation of some of the most cliched tropes you've seen from generic isekais. So, okay, get this. We're following a guy named Fate in a world that works on JRPG logic. You level up by fighting monsters, and everyone has special skills that are decided from birth. Fate's special skill, Gluttony, does nothing but make him hungry, or so he thinks. In reality, it lets him steal the stats and skills of people he kills, meaning he grows really strong, really quick, but oh my god, he technically can't gain experience, so he's always level 1. How wacky! Now, I don't want to rag on a story just for being in the genre it is, but this lack of imagination carries through to every aspect of its execution. Like, in just about every isekai, there's more to it than just a power fantasy. Yeah, the protagonist is overpowered, but he has to, like, do something. In Skeleton Knight in Another World, for example, our hero, Ark, takes on the slave trade, and the story then attempts to tell a story about the slave trade. And what makes that story redeemable is that there was actually something there. It was often clunky, ignorant, and offensive, but it had some amount of substance. It tried to say something. It explored issues. And all of this led to some baseline amount of pathos, stakes, and story. Berserk of Gluttony, though, makes zero attempt to explore the things it puts in front of you. It opens with these questions about wealth inequality, the idea of haves versus the have-nots, but at no point does it try to construct this into anything coherent. Fate is mistreated because his only way of earning money is to work for abusive people in power, and he needs money to eat. That's fine, it's a statement, but nothing that comes after it follows up on it in a sane way. The two people who comfort him in his time of strife are the man who will only feed him in exchange for the money that's costing him his well-being, and a convenient alternative rich person who's willing to be a nicer employer to him and who is also a pretty girl. And the reason he kills someone and discovers the nature of his power is because he's helping said nicer employer slaughter some thieves trying to take the riches in the castle. Just to hammer that in, the good guys of this story, a story ostensibly about wealth inequality, just slaughtered non-violent criminals, most likely impoverished criminals, for the crime of coveting the possessions of the rich. And I need to be absolutely clear here, the story does not seem to think that there is any contradiction there. It doesn't try to draw attention to it, it isn't pointing out tensions or difficult questions. Thieves just are acceptable targets. And a lot of this massacre was carried out by the cutie pie heartthrob love interest, who is oh so worried about our protagonist and is one of the good rich people. It is goodness unbound from any kind of moral framework, merely a character who treats the point of view protagonist well while possessing all of the outward signifiers of a cinnamon roll. Where all of this goes is not some condemnation of the status quo, but rather a frustration with ineptitude. It is taken for granted that the haves are superior to the have-nots, and the protagonist wants to be one of the haves. He wants to be good enough at something to be rewarded by the cruel but fair system before him, and, thanks to a coincidence of fate, he gets it. It is a story completely uninterested in analysis, introspection, or humanity, instead obsessed exclusively with aesthetics. It is not just a story you could enjoy if you turned your brain off, but a story which demands you turn it off. Because as far as the story is concerned, there is nothing worth thinking about here. It is proudly a story about nothing. It has no ideas, and nothing is important to it. If you want to keep hearing about these shows, I will be talking about them and more on my channel this season, including some I actually like, so make sure to subscribe with notifications on. Leave a like and a comment, and if you want to help me keep making these videos, then subscribe to my Patreon. The link is in the description, and as always, a big thank you to my patrons, especially my Tier 2 patrons, Bellman, Carolyn Vig, and Love Your Content.